people seem to be dying faster if you take those high-dose supplements. The vast majority of people would be a lot better off if they just didn't take supplements, particularly with vitamin A and vitamin E. From the human clinical studies that we've got at the moment, it actually seems to worsen lifespan.
Brad Stanfield is a primary care physician practicing in Auckland, New Zealand. He has a deep passion for preventative medicine and helping people lead healthy, long lives. To share the latest clinical guidelines and research, Brad created a YouTube channel that now has over 240,000 subscribers.
If you're taking antioxidant supplements, you blunt that oxidative stress, so you blunt the positive effects of exercise. And that's not just theory, that's actually been proven out in human randomized clinical trials. One group will be taking these antioxidant supplements and the other group will be taking a placebo. And at the end of the study, the group who's not taking the antioxidant supplements are stronger and fitter compared to the group who are taking the antioxidant supplements. People just need to be careful about what they're putting in their body. It's not going to be a magic pill in a bottle, unfortunately.
You've had this really interesting kind of journey to get to where you are right now. You started in a private medical facility, and now you make these YouTube videos. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that journey started?
Yeah, I suppose the journey started when I was working as a junior doctor in one of the hospitals here in Auckland, New Zealand. I started noticing that I was getting wrinkles around my eyes, and that gave me the spark that what are we doing about this aging thing? Are we any closer to solving aging? Can we do anything to slow down that process and even reverse it? So that kind of led me down a rabbit hole of looking at, what can we do for preventative care? What's on the horizon in terms of, treatments that specifically target aging, and that got me into thinking about trying to share some of the preventative care clinical guidelines, because that's what I'm doing now as my bread and butter in primary care. So I'm still a practicing doctor, so I see patients every week, and one of the big focuses of my work is what can we do to prevent that patient from needing to go into the hospitals that I used to work at. How can we keep them as healthy as possible for as long as possible? So that's the rough path as to how I got here.
How do your patients feel about having a celebrity doctor?
To be honest, not many of them know.
Oh, really?
I work at a semi-rural clinic that's, it's not the most financially well-off, and I selected that clinic to work at purposely because there's a lot of disease out there that could and should have been prevented, and that's the type of patient demographic that I really wanted to work with, where you can really make a massive difference as a doctor. Because yes, probably the people watching this podcast, they're probably already quite healthy. They're probably 95% of the way there in terms of what we can optimize. And I wanted to work with someone who's 50% of the way there, and again making that massive difference. So most of the patients that I see in the clinic, they've got no idea that I've got a YouTube channel, and I quite like it as that way. We kind of just interact as normal human beings. It's nice.
That's great. That's great. You can have that kind of normal relationship, but also reach millions of people at the same time. Yeah,
it's rewarding. It's that one-to-one that where you can really see the difference that you can make in someone's life, and then obviously the one-to-many with the YouTube channel. I'm very lucky to be in the position that I am.
Have you faced any backlash or criticism on the channel, either from your patients or from people that watch your videos?
Not in terms of patients that I see in the clinic, but every now and again a video will pop off. Someone's made a video about me, but I think that's kind of part and parcel of being a sort of public figure. You're always going to have people that don't quite see eye to eye, and that's absolutely fine. I think that the biggest criticism that I've come under, which I actually think is a strength, is that when new research comes available, I'll change my position on that research. So a classic example is when I was led down the rabbit hole of taking resveratrol supplements and not properly doing my research on this, because again I'm a primary care doctor. We don't necessarily deal with supplements, so this was quite a new world to me, and the people that I was following who I thought were trustworthy were taking resveratrol, so I kind of parroted off what they were talking about. But when I actually looked into the research myself, I realized, hey, this is not kosher. This is not something that we probably should be taking, if any. So there's no benefit to us in terms of humans, but it also seems to be harmful. So it seems to blunt the positive effects of exercise, and it seems to lower testosterone levels. So as soon as I came across that, I stopped taking resveratrol. But obviously, since I changed my position on that, I got criticized for it. But that's fine. That's all part and parcel of learning. And so now I'm far more rigorous, I suppose, in the research that I do, and again, following the clinical guidelines, because there are specific supplements within those clinical guidelines that are recommended. For example, creatine is fantastic for muscle performance. So, that's something that's safe, and that's something that I take.
It's probably helped for people to see that you've changed your position, that they can see the growth in the field and the changing research and everything that's coming out about it. If we can talk a little bit about resveratrol and a little bit of controversy about Dr. David Sinclair, because he's done all these studies on resveratrol. You made a video that referred to him with the title of a $720 million train wreck. Can we talk a little bit about his studies in resveratrol and how they've been difficult to replicate?
We have to go through a bit of a journey. So this all kicked off in the late 1990s, where now Professor David Sinclair and a professor called Matt Kaberlein, they were doing a lot of research in genes called SIR2 or sirtuins, and it seems that in yeast, if you overactivate the SIR2 gene, those yeast could replicate more often compared to yeast that weren't overactivating that SIR2 gene. So that gave the idea that maybe if mammals overactivate the sirtuin-1 gene, that we too could see lifespan extension effects. So unfortunately, a lot of that initial research in terms of trying to activate the sirtuin-1 gene, it causing a lifespan extension, those results have never actually been replicated. So David Sinclair's lab did say, yes, if you overactivate the sirtuin-1 gene, you can see a lifespan extension effect, but that hasn't been replicated. And then he also said that resveratrol activates sirtuin-1, and that's not been replicated either. So when you dive into the story, you realize how it's this reproducibility crisis where, yes, one researcher may see a really exciting result in their lab, but you can't get carried away with it. He ended up actually selling that research for $720 million, and then the can of worms started to get spilled open where none of it was replicatable, and it didn't apply to humans. Resveratrol didn't work, and so GSK, who actually bought David Sinclair's research, again, were left out of pocket more than $720 million, because they spent even more money trying to replicate the research and seeing if there was any possibility of getting a return on their investment, but there was none. So after 5 years of trying, they shuttered the doors on that department. And yeah, it's a warning sign, I think, for scientists not to get too ahead of themselves with the result that they may see in their lab. We need to replicate things. We need to see if it's going to work in mice, then in humans, before we start getting too excited about it. So, once people start to know the story, I think they're far more cautious about what supplements they're buying, on the internet and ingesting.
Right, and he's got this, like, the weight of Harvard Medical School behind him. Which is kind of surprising given the criticism and the backlash he's faced. Do you think that adds to the reason why so many people take his work seriously?
Yeah, that's why I got roped into taking resveratrol supplements. I thought, well, a Harvard professor who's studying aging and genetics, if he's seen some really promising results in his lab and he's got all of this fame behind him and Harvard's name behind him, there's probably something here. And again, I was very new to this field, which is no excuse. I should have done my proper research into it, but I was led astray through no faults of anyone's but my own. It's a tricky one. He's got tenure at Harvard. I don't quite know the politics behind it, because it's not a good look for all of this to have come out. Sure. and kind of dragging Harvard's name through it all. But here we are, and I think it's up to people. It's up to doctors such as myself trying to spread the word to their patients and to and online to make sure that people aren't taking things that they probably shouldn't, or at least educating people so that they know that there's two sides to a story. Do
you think that there's maybe a conflict of opinion regarding commercial interests versus ethics? Do you think that comes into play at all?
Huge. But it's not just the supplement world, it's the drug companies as well. So one of the things that we get drilled into us in medical school is to always look at, who's funded the studies, is there any conflicts of interest, is there any sort of tampering of the data? And doctors are aware of this, and I think, again, that's one of the big reasons why I wanted to start my channel, was showing that we need to, apply that rigor to the supplement world as well. Because there are some supplements that do have some really good, well-conducted research, but unfortunately there's also a lot of research out there that hasn't been conducted in the most ideal way, that do have conflicts of interest, that are funded by supplement companies, and the supplement industry is often unregulated, so it's kind of the wild west out there, and it does mean that supplement companies can say things in terms of their marketing material and run studies to generate the results that they want. So we just need to be careful.
Do you think that needs to change, how things are regulated?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because on one hand, you want people to have choice, right? So a classic example of this was NAC or NAC supplements. They were banned by the FDA, but there's a loophole that still allows you to purchase and ingest NAC supplements if you want. And I think people should have that choice. Equally, I think we just need to be very careful about the types of claims that are being made online about how we can educate the public to say, yes, the supplement may have some promising research in the preclinical world, but we just need to be careful that most of what happens in the preclinical world doesn't translate particularly well to humans. And there are supplements out there that can cause you harm.
It seems like sometimes people's vulnerabilities are taken advantage of, because there's not much information out there regarding longevity, but that's something people really, really care about. Do you see change in the longevity trend towards playing to people's vulnerabilities and taking advantage of them at all?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because we all want to believe that most of our health problems can be solved by just taking a pill and a bottle. But the unfortunate reality is that it can't. It's the hard work of diet, exercise, sleep, mental health, all of that really is the bedrock of preventative care. And supplements, they offer maybe a 1 to 5% icing on the cake, but it's all of the other foundations that we need to focus on. So supplement companies are very good at, playing to those wants and fears, that if you don't take this particular supplement, you might be missing out because it's looking so promising in the preclinical world, yet, most of it, again, doesn't translate into humans. I don't think there's a particularly good answer for it, aside from, like I mentioned, just getting more information out into people's hands and trying to direct, people to databases that have actually been really well researched. So, for example, the NIH has a supplement database. It's well researched, it's well conducted. There's probably 100 or more different supplements, and it's completely free. You don't need to sign up, you don't need to pay. You can just go there and you can have a look at a particular supplement. Another website that's fantastic is consumerlab.com. So that one's a paid website. I think that the fee per year, it's something like $50, but you'll probably end up spending more on supplements each year than that $50 subscription. But it's wonderful that it's very well researched. They don't overhype things. So there are solutions that are coming, I think. Trying to at least have these resources where people can trust and make their health decisions based on that.
You're able to put all this information out there. Do you think sometimes there's too much information on the web, because you have all these competing interests? You have, sponsored ads that people don't realize sometimes that are sponsored ads, and then they have, genuine, well thought out videos for people looking out for, other people's best interests, like what your channel does. Do you think social media needs to be somehow regulated, or do you think that can somehow change how people view their medical desires and needs?
There are certain channels that are fantastic at storytelling, at spinning a narrative and explaining, quite complex health problems and potential solutions in an easy to understand way. The trouble is a lot of that information is incorrect. It's been either disproven or goes completely against the clinical guidelines. So I think it's up to primary care physicians such as myself who are interested in this space, who see patients every day who are want to prevent disease, and we see it firsthand, and we're armed with the knowledge after years of training and continued training. I think it's up to us to do a better job of explaining people's health conditions and explaining the treatments as per the clinical guidelines. I don't think that information should be locked down, or social media companies should put their thumb on the scale, because I think that from COVID, I think we learned, social media companies learned a lot from that experience, where if you try and shift a particular narrative, it really doesn't go well. People don't like having smoke and mirrors in front of them. So I think it's just up to people like myself to put out better information. It's up to us just to do a better job, because healthcare professionals like myself, we've left this void on social media that's been filled by, for want of a better word, charlatans, again, who are very good at explaining health concepts, and it's up to us to front up and do a better job.
And it must be much harder for a primary care physician like yourself than it was, say, 10 or 15 years ago, when you were like the end-all be-all for your patients, right? They would come to you and they would ask questions, and maybe if they were really well versed in this stuff, they could do their own research. But now it's so much more information that they have to weed through themselves, and you don't know how they're being influenced, at home. And so you've got to kind of cut through the nonsense to get the real information to them.
To be honest, I actually prefer it when patients research themselves. It means that they genuinely care about their health. They want to be as healthy as possible for as long as possible. And those patients, generally, if you show them the information, you can show them the guidelines, you can show them the studies behind why those guidelines are written in a particular way. And it's relatively easy to say, look, this is our recommendations because of the research. And it's up to you how you want to, what you want to do with your health from that point on. The difficulty I have is patients who don't particularly care about their health, or who are too busy to look after their health or prioritize it. Those are the patients that are tricky, and you need to work doubly hard on to help. But the patients who want to, again, research their own health, they're actually wonderful. I really enjoy working with those types of patients.
Can we talk a little bit about all the different kind of studies that are out there and how we can, as consumers, break them down? There's human studies, animal studies, cell studies. What do you find most compelling, and how should we process this information as consumers? I
think animal studies are interesting because there'll always be another headline saying, we found this works in mice and it extends lifespan, or it does something amazing, and it's very easy to generate interest within that topic. I'd just be very wary of it, because like I mentioned before, most of the animal studies, they don't translate well to humans, and obviously we're humans, so we should be looking at human trials. Now there's human trials and then there's human trials, so you'll often hear people saying, I did a particular workout, or I ate a particular diet, or I'm taking a particular supplement and I feel wonderful, therefore you're probably going to feel wonderful as well. Right. And those anecdotal studies, they're not particularly compelling, because what works for one person may not work for another. And then the next step up is observational studies. So if you just observe a population, and you try and draw conclusions, so maybe one population or one group of the population eats a particular diet and they live longer compared to another group who eat a different diet. And you can say, well, maybe that diet works a bit better, but you have to be careful. It's maybe. The only real way to figure out if something is truly beneficial for human health in general is randomized controlled trials. So this is where you take a group of people, you randomize them into two groups at the same time, you follow them up for a period of time, and you can see whether that intervention is going to make a positive or negative impact on human health. So if you're going to try and do your own research, I would just make sure that you're reading human randomized controlled trials. But if you want to cut through all of that, there are databases that have done this for you already. Again, it's the NIH supplement database, consumerlab.com, your own primary care physician who have got access to the clinical guidelines. If you wanted to look at the clinical guidelines themselves, that's a bit tricky because it can be quite expensive to do. It costs about $1,000 per year for doctors such as myself to have access to that. So on my website, I actually distilled all of the preventative care research and guidelines into hopefully a easy to understand roadmap.
Oh, that's amazing.
So on my website, I've got that, and it's completely free. So there are good resources out there if you wanted to do your own research. But if you wanted to delve into the studies, make sure it's a human randomized controlled trial.
Do you think that they are focusing too much on animal studies and cell studies? Do you think that there are enough human studies happening?
Yeah, human studies are incredibly expensive to run. So that's why you'll often hear about, single cell research or mice research, because they are a lot cheaper. And also the stakes are a bit low. If something goes a bit wonky, do we want more human clinical trials? Absolutely. Do we want more funding? Absolutely. Unfortunately, we don't have infinite money though. So we just need to be quite selective about what molecules we are testing. In the limited resources that we have. So say, for example, rapamycin is one of the leading candidates for lifespan extension in the animal studies, but very few human clinical trials have been done on this. And the primary reason for that is there's no money. That rapamycin was discovered in the 1960s. So you can't really patent it. You can't get a return on investment. So I've set up a rapamycin human study that's now thankfully funded, and it's recruiting patients at the moment. But that took me, 3.5 years to fund, to fundraise, because again, you have to rely on donations to get it over the road.
That's really exciting that you're doing that study. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so rapamycin in both male and females mice, it extends lifespan by over 20%. But in human clinical medicine, rapamycin's got a bit of a dirty name. So what I mean by that is it's used to suppress the immune system. So say if you needed to have a kidney transplant, one of the medications that you'll be on to prevent your own immune system from rejecting that organ and attacking that donated organ is rapamycin. So it's been quite tricky to convince the medical community that this immunosuppressant can be potentially used to extend lifespan, because whenever you think of suppressing the immune system, you think of, increased infections, increased cancer. But it seems that if you get the dose correct, that's a sweet spot. So currently there's a lot of people, and I don't condone this, but there's a lot of people who are taking rapamycin off label, and they typically take about 6 milligrams once a week. That's hopefully to maximize the benefits of rapamycin and minimize the potential harms. But again, we don't have the human clinical research yet, which is one of the reasons why I've set up my study. So rapamycin works by blocking an enzyme called mTOR. Now, when you exercise, you activate mTOR. That's what helps to build new proteins and build muscle. The trouble is, as we get older, our muscles, they seem to recognize that they're getting weaker. So they overactivate mTOR, like they're trying to compensate and trying to build themselves up. But when you overactivate mTOR, you block a separate process called autophagy from happening. So autophagy is the cell clearance process. So think of it like your old muscles are hoarding all of these damaged components, and they're never given a chance to flush them away.
Sure.
So if we use, the theory is that if we use rapamycin, once a week or once a fortnight, we allow our muscle cells to flush away those old damaged components, so that when we exercise, we can rebuild new ones. So that's the theory that we're testing with my clinical study. So participants will be exercising on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and then they'll take the rapamycin on Saturday. And it's hoped that if we take the rapamycin on a day that we don't exercise, again, we flush away all of those old damaged components. Then when we exercise, we can activate mTOR and rebuild new ones. Now, I don't think it's a good idea for people to be taking rapamycin outside of these clinical studies, because we don't know what effects there will be. And hopefully once we know a bit more from my clinical study and from others that are happening at the moment, that there's a possibility that maybe in the future we'll all be taking rapamycin, but we're not there yet.
Interesting. Do you think it's difficult to find human participants, people who are willing to do this? Or are people excited about it? Yeah,
people are really excited about it, because there is the potential that it can help older adults hold on to their muscle strength. So that's been quite compelling to for people to want to be participating within my study. I think people are really excited about it. So that's not been the difficulty. The difficulty is the funding. It's incredibly expensive to run these studies. So, if anyone wants to make a massive difference in the world and they're not too sure, where to put their money, clinical trials such as this one that I'm doing at the moment, that's where you can make a real impact.
That's really interesting. Are there any other studies that you are interested in, aside from rapamycin, that you see on the horizon?
Yeah, so there are a few supplements that I'm already taking. So, for example, creatine for its muscle performance effects. But there's some emerging research to suggest that it improves brain performance as well, improves cognition, particularly in older adults. So there was a meta-analysis published, I think it was in 2022. So a meta-analysis is where you combine all of the human randomized clinical trials together and see what they show. And there was a pretty robust effect that people who were taking creatine compared to a placebo or a dummy medication seemed to have improved cognition. So that's a really interesting space. I think there's still some larger longer term randomized trials that need to be done before anything conclusive is said, but that's something really, really promising. It's the same thing for multivitamin and mineral supplements. So there's a study called the Cosmos study, which is a massive study, but within that huge study there were 3 separate trials that were looking also at cognition, and it seems that a well-formulated multivitamin and mineral supplement seemed to improve the cognition of older adults compared to a placebo. Then there's a couple for skin health, so collagen and hyaluronic acid. Again, they've got good evidence from human randomized clinical trials. Things like psyllium husk. Psyllium husk is fantastic for lowering your cholesterol levels, seems to be good for your gut microbiome, and through those effects, there's some good research to suggest that it lowers cardiovascular disease. So there are some things that we could be, potentially taking now that do have real impacts on our health. But in terms of big plays for trying to extend lifespan, rapamycin, that's probably the most exciting that's come from the preclinical world. There are a couple of other molecules that have come about though. So one of them is a drug called, it's a class of medication called SGLT2 inhibitors. This class of medication is used in type 2 diabetics. It basically tells the kidneys to flush out or to pee out sugar. But when this class of medication is tested in mice, it extends male lifespan. It was about 10 to 15%. This is it's a program called the Interventions Testing Program. So that's something really interesting to follow as well. Again, because it's already used in clinical medicine, and it's now not just used for diabetics, it's used in chronic kidney disease, and it's used in heart failure patients, even if they don't have diabetes. So there's more and more indications that are being found for that class of medication. And then the one other thing that I'm keeping my eye on is hormone therapies, specifically in the Interventions Testing Program. Again, this is in mice. Believe it or not, there's a non-feminizing estrogen called 17-alpha-estradiol in male mice, which is surprising. That also extended lifespan by about 10 to 15%. There was no lifespan extension seen for females, unfortunately, but that non-feminizing estrogen seems to have some effect. And not many clinical trials in humans have been done on that one either. So there's a lot of scope, I think, for some really impactful studies to be done in humans, taking from well-conducted preclinical work and seeing if it will, have important effects for humans.
So you've talked about the good stuff. Can you think of any controversial or stuff that seems a little bit sketchy, that's being investigated right now? So
yeah, we've already talked about resveratrol and why I'm concerned about people taking that supplement, again, because of the side effects that it does have. There's a couple of other supplements that I think people should be aware of in terms of their side effects. So one of them is antioxidant supplements. So this is things like high-dose vitamin A, high-dose vitamin C, high-dose vitamin E. Particularly with vitamin A and vitamin E, from the human clinical studies that we've got at the moment, it actually seems to worsen lifespan. People seem to be dying faster if you take those high-dose supplements compared to if you don't. And that's not the only effect. So when we exercise, we release all sorts of oxidants. And that's a good thing. It signals to our body that it needs to become fitter to deal with that stress. But if you're taking antioxidant supplements, you blunt that oxidative stress. So you blunt the positive effects of exercise. And that's not just theory. That's actually been proven out in human randomized clinical trials. So what they'll do is they'll take a group of people, they'll exercise them. One group will be taking these antioxidant supplements and the other group will be taking a placebo. And at the end of the study, the group who's not taking the antioxidant supplements are stronger and fitter compared to the group who are taking the antioxidant supplements. So people just need to be careful about what they're putting in their body, because we were sold for such a long time that antioxidants were going to be, wonderful for us, that they were going to be miracles, they were going to lower cancer rates, they were going to extend lifespan. But they don't seem to do that. If anything, they seem to, again, worsen muscle performance. Now, antioxidant foods, absolutely. Your fruits, your vegetables, brilliant. I'm talking about supplementing specifically at high doses.
I feel like that's too what, like when you go to the grocery store, that's what you see, like on the wall, like A and E and everything else. You don't see these, collagen or all the rapamycin. You don't see these things so readily available for consumers, but you see what you're talking about.
The vast majority of people would be a lot better off if they just didn't take supplements. If they just focused in on, say you've got $100 a month to spend on your health. If you're spending that on supplements rather than, at-home gym equipment or a gym membership or high-quality foods, that's where that's where you can make a massive difference to your health. It's your diet, your exercise, your sleep. Supplements is the icing on the cake. But you need to build up that cake.
Right. Like the foundation. I can see the primary care doctor in you coming out.
Yeah.
So you've publicly shared that you stopped taking NMN. Can we talk about that for a minute and where your opinions on that drug changed?
This is quite similar to Resveratrol in that when I first started my channel and looking into the supplement world, I started taking NMN because of what other people were doing, which is an idiotic thing to do. I didn't do my research properly. And again, when I looked into the research at the time, there was only one human study. And that one human study was just giving NMN once to people to make sure that there weren't any significant side effects. That was the only human study.
Wow.
Yet I was taking NMN at the time. Now, subsequently, there's been, I want to say about 18 to 20 human randomized studies. The trouble is, when you look at these studies, they don't seem to have a marked, in terms of NMN, that it doesn't seem to have a marked effect. So they've looked at mood, they've looked at exercise, they've looked at cholesterol, they've looked at heart health. There doesn't seem to be much effect. So what I mean by that is some studies will suggest, yes, maybe there's something here, but then another study will say, no, actually there's no effect. So you've got these conflicting results, and part of the reason for why these results are so conflicting is that often the studies are small, and they're funded by supplement companies. And like I mentioned before, you just need to be careful about who's funding these studies, because they can massage the data to fit the narrative. And the narrative generally is, for a supplement company, is that they want to show that their supplement works, and that will drive sales. So you just need to be careful. When I think it was about 3 months ago, I did a deep dive into all of the human studies and created a table, basically saying, looking at all of the different measures in the human clinical studies to see, are there any patterns here? Is there a clear benefit of exercise, a clear benefit again to heart health? And nothing is clear. So for me, there's no obvious benefit from taking NMN supplements, looking at the research. But there's the potential of harm. And in clinical medicine, vitamin B3, which is what NMN is, it's a type of vitamin B3. High-dose vitamin B3 in the form of niacin was used to lower LDL cholesterol levels. It was thought to help to be protective against cardiovascular disease. Now, unfortunately, those studies didn't pan out. And what I mean by that is the group who was taking the high-dose vitamin B3 supplements, they actually seemed to have higher rates of cardiovascular disease. They had higher rates of heart attacks. So high-dose vitamin B3 is no longer used or prescribed in clinical medicine because of the human studies that we've got. And NMN in the gut seems to be converted into niacin before it's absorbed. So there's a possibility that if you're taking NMN supplements, you're actually taking high-dose niacin. And we know that high-dose niacin seems to worsen mortality, so worsen death rates, and cardiovascular disease. So I'm cautious. One of the big points that I try and get across on my channel is the dangers of megadosing. If you start to ingest things that the body was not designed for or you don't find in nature, that's when you start to really run into problems. And that's where you need to rely on human clinical studies.
Are there any other supplements besides NMN that you advise people just like, not good for you, don't take this?
The big ones that I think we've already mentioned, so resveratrol, high-dose antioxidant supplements, particularly vitamin A and vitamin E. There is another medication it's a diabetic medication called metformin. So pre-diabetic patients will use metformin to help prevent developing full-blown type 2 diabetes, and type 2 diabetic patients will be on metformin. The evidence is very clear on that. But in the so-called longevity space, a lot of people have started taking metformin because of some initial mice research to suggest that it may extend mice lifespan. Now, if we just spend a little bit of time on that, the initial mice studies that were done that were exciting, these mice were inbred and they had a genetic predisposition to high blood pressure. So in those selective mice, yes, there was a lifespan extension effect. But when the interventions testing program trialed metformin, so on the point of the interventions testing program, they run the same experiment at the same time in 3 separate labs, and they use genetically diverse mice. So in theory, the results from those mice are more applicable to humans. There was no lifespan extension effect seen. Then there was a study looking from the diabetes prevention program that ran for, I believe it was 18 years, that showed that non-diabetics taking metformin, compared to a placebo, there was no effect on cancer, on cardiovascular disease, on overall death rates. So I'm not convinced that there's a significant benefit for non-diabetics taking metformin.
Where did people start hearing about metformin?
Yeah, it's an incredibly common medication. It's very, very cheap. Clinical medicine has been using it for decades. So when it looked like non-diabetics could potentially have these effects in terms of lifespan extension, both from the mice studies and also from the human observational studies, it looked like type 2 diabetics who only needed metformin to control their diabetes seemed to have lower heart disease compared to non-diabetics. So that again just fueled the excitement for metformin. But that also leads into the dangers of observational studies, and that's why randomized controlled trials are critical, because when the diabetes prevention program did that study of metformin in non-diabetics, there were no effects seen. So there's a study going on by a professor in the university, and it's called the TAME study. So I'm interested to see the results of that. But again, in clinical medicine, we already use metformin for pre-diabetics and type 2 diabetic patients. So for me, the only question mark is what should non-diabetics be doing about metformin? And I'm not convinced there's any benefit, but we do have evidence of harm. So much like the antioxidant discussion, when there's been 2 to 3 studies now showing that when people who exercise, when they take metformin, they blunt the positive effects of exercise. So they're less fit compared to if they were taking a placebo. And metformin also lowers testosterone levels. So we just need to be careful about taking something with unproven benefits and known harms.
There's a few other longevity supplements I'd like to talk to you about, like taurine, CoQ10, collagen. What are your opinions on these drugs? So
taurine, people may have heard about because often the energy drinks that they take has got taurine mixed in.
Oh, that's right. I didn't even think about that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's got some interesting effects in cells on the mitochondria, so the powerhouses of our cells. And there was a fascinating mouse study published last year, I believe it was, showing a lifespan extension effect in mice. So I believe the interventions testing program is about to trial taurine to see if there's any true benefit in mice or not. I take taurine, but not in the way that you may expect. When you take magnesium, you can't just take magnesium. It has to be complexed with something else. So I take magnesium taurate. So it's a mixture of both magnesium and taurine. So that's how I get my taurine. And that's interested but not sold yet about the human benefits of taurine. It's a fascinating field to follow. CoQ10 has been studied a lot in humans, specifically whether it helps for patients that take statin medications. So those are the cholesterol-lowering medications. About 1 to 2% of people who take statin medications, they will develop muscle aches. And it was hoped that for those patients, CoQ10 could reduce that reduce that risk of happening. But unfortunately, there's been no benefit seen. So I don't take CoQ10. The interventions testing program, they trialed CoQ10, I believe, and there was no effect seen. So I'm just not convinced that there's any true benefit there. I think it's highly unlikely that there's going to be any lifespan extension effect from collagen supplements. The reason why I take collagen is for skin health. So collagen peptides, they're very short chains of amino acids, and amino acids make up proteins. Now, these very small chains of amino acids, or these peptides, they can be directly absorbed by the gut into our bloodstream and reach our skin. That's been proven out in multiple studies. But crucially, in the randomized human studies, where people take either the collagen or a placebo, there's about a 9% improvement in skin wrinkles and skin hydration in the group who takes the collagen peptides. So that's the reason why I take it. Now, it's controversial because since these peptides are amino acids, critics of collagen supplements will say if you're eating enough protein, you're getting all of the amino acids that you could possibly want, and therefore there should be no effect on your skin. The one study that I know of that directly compared collagen supplements to protein supplements was in burn patients. So these patients had suffered burns. One group took the protein, and the other group took the collagen peptides. And the collagen peptide group, the burn wounds, they healed much faster compared to the group who was taking regular protein. So I think for me that seems to indicate that there is something happening with the skin by taking collagen peptides. So yeah, that's why I take it.
When we talk about skin also, can you talk a little bit about red light therapy and whether you think it's effective and if it's the latest thing? And
yeah, I recently did a video about this. Virtually all of the studies of red light therapy, they will be funded by companies who sell these red light devices. So again, we have to think about conflict here. But despite that, one study will show a benefit, another study won't. Another study will use a particular wavelength of red light that may show a benefit, but then yet another study will use that same wavelength and there's no benefit. So I don't use red light therapy. I think there are more evidence-based ways, that have true effects on our skin. So one of the best things that people can do for their skin is wear sunscreen every day. Mm-hmm. And another fantastic thing people can do is use a retinoid cream. Those two things are probably the most powerful that people can do in terms of targeted skin therapies to protect their skin and to help with aging. I'm
going to write that one down. Retinoids, that's good.
Yeah.
How about NR and NAD plus in anti-aging? Do you have any opinion on those?
Yeah, so this is very similar to the discussion about NMN supplements. So NMN, NR, niacin, they're all forms of vitamin B3. There's one particular supplement company who's heavily involved in NR. They will tell you that NR supplements are wonderful. I'm not convinced about the human research so far. So from the human research that we have at the moment, there are some markers of inflammation that appear to go down if we take NR supplements. But looking at markers and then trying to extrapolate that into actual human clinical outcomes, they're two very different things. So what I mean by that is, yes, you may see that a particular inflammatory marker goes down on a blood test, but what does that actually mean for your health? Does that mean that you're going to run faster? Does that mean that you're going to think faster? Does that mean you're going to have lower rates of heart disease and cancer? We don't know. So I'm not convinced that high-dose vitamin B3 supplements are the way to go, particularly because, again, from the large-scale trials of niacin, that's probably not, that's not great for our, mortality or cardiovascular disease.
And then I want to talk about the health of different body parts, skin, joints, internal organs, things like that. What do you think people should consider with regards to compounds, in terms of treating individual body parts as opposed to the whole body?
I think it's very easy to overcomplicate the body. I think if we boil it down and think, what am I actually going to do to be healthy? And it's the basics, like I've mentioned multiple times so far. It's diet, exercise, and sleep. But then you say, well, what does that mean? Yes, I can say diet, exercise, and sleep on a podcast, but for people listening, what should they actually be doing? So for diet, one of the best things that we can do is eat a whole food diet. So what I mean by that is a lot of the foods that we eat today are processed, that they've stripped away a lot of the nutrients, they're packed with sugar. So if we can get back to whole foods, whole fruits and vegetables with lots of fiber, with lots of nutrients, that is fantastic for our body. Then we also want to make sure that we're not having too many calories. Now again, that's a lot easier said than done, particularly in our food environment. Obesity rates, they really started to skyrocket in the 1970s, and we don't have a perfect understanding as to why that has happened. There's many different theories, but it's a tricky one to crack, particularly because in the diet studies alone, I'm talking about long-term diet studies, there doesn't seem to be a huge difference, compared to the different diet outcomes. So in terms of whether people are on the keto diet or whether they're on paleo or vegan, all of them seem to help people lose weight if they don't consume that many calories. And over a 1 year period, the differences in weight loss is very, very small. And it's very, very difficult to also keep that weight off through diet alone. So that's why the GLP-1 class of medication, so Ozempic, has really taken off, because that's helped people not feel as hungry and reduce their overall calorie intake, and it's helped them stick to the diet that they have always wanted to and keep at a healthy weight. So that's staying at a healthy weight is one of the best things that you can do. It's fantastic for your heart health, for your joints, for your liver. So I think instead of just thinking, what's going to be good for my heart, I think we just actually need to think, what's going to be good for my body? What am I actually going to do to be healthy? And it's eating whole foods, making sure we're not having, too many calories, having water rather than fizzy drink. It's the basics that often people unfortunately don't want to do, but that's really the bulk of it. Yeah, it's the hard stuff that people need to lean into. It's not going to be a magic pill in a bottle, unfortunately.
I want to jump back real quick to Ozempic, because you mentioned that. Can you tell me your opinion on Ozempic? Do you recommend it to your patients?
There's been a couple of concerns about this class of medication, specifically two main concerns. One of them is that when you stop Ozempic, your weight just comes back on. And that's absolutely correct. It's just like if you're taking a cholesterol medication. If you stop the cholesterol medication, your cholesterol goes back up. Or if you stop your blood pressure medications, your blood pressure generally goes back up. It's the exact same thing with this class of medication. If you stop it, the hunger comes back, your appetite returns, most patients regain the weight that they've lost. So unfortunately, it is a long-term medication. But then the second main concern on social media is muscle loss. So when you lose weight, unfortunately, you don't just lose fat, you also lose muscle. You can mitigate that, you can reduce the amount of muscle that you lost, but for any weight loss, no matter what the strategy, you will lose muscle mass. And unfortunately, that's been picked up as a reason, mostly from people who sell diet courses, to not go onto Ozempic. If you have enough protein in your diet and you're doing resistance exercise, you can mitigate most of that muscle loss. And again, this muscle loss issue is not, it doesn't just affect GLP-1. It's any form of weight loss will have this effect. So I think this concern has unfortunately been, taken up by, diet gurus who are trying to sell you diet courses and different supplements. And again, we just need to think about conflicts of interest. Yeah,
it's also been taken up, you mentioned diet gurus, but I see a lot of celebrities and people are always speculating, is this person on Ozempic? They've lost tons of weight, like in a very short period of time. Do you think that has some influence on people when they see celebrities?
People are rightfully skeptical when something miraculous seems to be happening. Is it too good to be true? Is there some unknown side effect that we don't know about? I hate to say this, but this class of medication does seem to be a bit of a miracle. And I've seen this firsthand with my diabetic patients and my patients who want to lose weight. So since this medication became available in New Zealand, I've been putting my type 2 diabetics on it, and the amount of patients that we've managed to stop their insulin injections, we've managed to reduce their blood pressure pills, we've managed to reduce their cholesterol medications, their joint pains have mostly resolved because they're not carrying all of this excess weight, that they don't have back pain anymore. People who were struggling with alcohol addiction and were overweight, that it seems to wipe that away as well. So it does seem to be a wonderful class of medication for most people. There are some people who develop nausea, and that nausea just doesn't go away. In terms of if they continue taking the medication, that they remain nauseous. Most people, their body does get used to it and the nausea completely goes away, but there are some where it just continues and they have to stop taking the medication. But outside of those people, it's a pretty wonderful med.
I just want to ask if there was one message you could give our listeners and viewers, if there's one thing you can say as a primary care doctor and as someone who has a lot of influence on YouTube about your health, what would it be? I
think see your primary care physician and talk to them about preventative care. A lot of people are frustrated with primary care because it's often a reactive system, as in something's wrong with you and that's where you go and see your doctor. Most people don't see their doctor proactively to talk with them about preventative care. And I wish all of my patients would do that. So that's one thing. And then, sorry, I know you said one thing, but the second thing, I've said this a couple of times, but supplements are not the way to make real impacts with your health. We have to do the hard work of diet, exercise, and sleep. Supplements are interesting to talk about because they may hold some promise, and we always want to have a quick fix in a bottle, but no matter where the research takes us, diet, exercise, and sleep will always be critical to our health, and we need to get that right. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a really enlightening conversation, and I know that people probably gained a lot from this conversation, so thank you so much. Thanks, it was fun. That was Dr. Brad Stanfield. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed our conversation, and I hope we'll see you next time.